This is a 25-year-old Bary Grant 750 of 4779 stage 3. I got it from Bary Grant himself. So the way the gas works in the car, I showed you the system in my car, and here's one of the float bowls, extra one, and down in my carburetor box, here's a needle and seat. So the gas is coming in that side of the carburetor, it's coming in here. There's a float bowl right here, and underneath this screw and nut is the needle and seat. And here's the needle and seat fixture, and the way this works is it screws into the float bowl, and you actually screw this down or up by turning the nut that's on the float bowl here. The screw on top, you just loosen that up to loosen up the nut. The nut is actually able to turn that needle and seat, and when it turns the needle and seat, it raises it. There you can see the actual tip of it, and that rests on top of the float like that. So as the float goes up, eventually it closes that little needle off in the seat and no more gas comes in. But when the float drops down, then that little pin is exposed, and that opens the, pull that out again. Here you can see the actual little Viton needle, and as that closes, the needle falls into a hole there. Depends on the size of that hole, how much fuel flows through this needle and seat. But this is all controlled by the float. Once the float bowl fills up with gas and the float rises, then that closes off the needle and seat, and that stops the flow of gas into the carburetor. And as you're going down the road or going down the track and using up more fuel, the float drops, more fuel comes in. When you have enough fuel, the float will close, but most of the time it's moving just a little bit up and down as you're taking gas into the system. So here's a needle and seat assembly, and you can see the retaining screw on the top, the small washer, the small gasket washer, and then the nut, the adjusting nut, and then the larger gasket washer, all attached around the needle and seat. So that whole assembly goes down there, and that's the way it goes. And again, the nut does the adjusting. Turn the nut clockwise to lower the float, turn the clock counterclockwise to raise the float, and when you get it where you want it, you tighten the set screw down on top. I covered that before, but I can't cover it enough. People just don't seem to understand. And fuel will squirt out if you do this when the car is running, so have a rag handy. I got this Holley carburetor upside down, so just give you a couple of basics here. Who knows what. You don't know if you don't know. Holley gets fuel different ways at different times. When it's idling, this little port here underneath the throttles, and the carburetor is turned upside down here, that little port there is the idle port, and that feeds you a little bit of fuel based on how the idle mixture screw on the side of the carburetor is adjusted. Then as you start to step on the gas a little bit and open the throttle, the carburetor exposes this little slit called the transition port. You see it coming open right there, that little square straight line there is a little port, and that feeds more fuel into the car as the throttle opens more. So you've got the idle port and the transition slot that feed fuel. Then as you open further, the car goes into cruise mode and you start running off your main jets. But changing your jets at idle does nothing to your idle setup. These two pieces here, the idle feed port and the transition slot, are fed by the idle mixture screws. on the side of the metering block. That's not the idle adjustment screw that sets your idle speed. That's your idle mixture screw, and that screw controls how much fuel gets to the idle port and to the transition slot. So here's the main body and the throttle base on my carburetor. I got the screws taken out of it so I can take the main section off, and you can get a better look here at the transition slot. That's that little slot right here. It's on all four barrels of the carburetor, and if I measure that slot, it's 22 thousandths wide, and if I open it up and I measure with my dial indicator to the bottom, it's 150 thousandths deep. So that works. A lot of the new carburetors have huge transition slots. I'm not sure why. It looks like one manufacturer's just copying the other manufacturer and nobody really knows what they're doing. Some of them are okay, but you really want to look at that transition slot, because that's a big booger in getting your tuning right for low speed driving around town, coming off of the idle circuit and into the main jets. And that transition slot, that transition circuit, is controlled to a big extent by the idle air bleed in the carburetor. Outside one is the idle air bleed, and by making that idle air bleed bigger, not only do you get a little bit leaner in your idle circuit, but it also makes the transition slot taper off sooner. So maybe that transition slot is hanging on to 2,500 RPMs, 2,600 RPMs. That's too much. That makes your air-fuel mixture go from a nice mixture at idle to getting real rich in the 2,000 to 2,500 RPM range, and then coming back under control of the main jets where you can get it to work. But you need that transition slot to be working right. So there's a couple ways to do that, but the idle air bleed is definitely a start. And you want that idle air bleed about 76, 78 thousandths, and you want the other one, the inside one, the high-speed air bleed, fairly small. Making that one small makes it richer at top end. You want that one down probably about 24, 25, 26 thousandths. At that point you got to play around with it. Every combination is different, but bigger on the idle air bleed and smaller on the high-speed air bleed is a good way to start. If that transition slot is too big and you can't get it under control, then the next plan is to drill and tap the main body in the transition slot feed hole and put a little brass set screw in there and neck that down to 60,000, someplace around there, to try and get that transition slot a little bit leaner. Lots of little places to drill holes and screw up your carburetor. Go slowly. So here's a metering block, and down here in the metering block, this is the idle feed restriction. On some metering blocks you'll see the idle feed restriction up at the top here. I like it better on the bottom. It's a more stable idle circuit. So the idle feed restriction, this little jet here, or orifice here, if it hadn't been drilled out and tapped for a jet, this controls the amount of fuel that goes to the idle circuit that the idle mixture screw here regulates. That controls the fuel that goes to the idle port and to the transition slot. And ideally you want this screw open about a turn or a turn and a quarter. If it's less than a turn and a quarter, then you've got it tightened down because you're getting too much fuel into the system. And maybe by making this idle feed restriction here a little smaller, you gain a little bit more control. If you've got this idle mixture screw way out, then you're not getting enough fuel into the system, and maybe this idle feed restriction here needs to be made a little bit bigger. This all goes pretty small from the factory. They're about 33 thousandths. Maybe you go down to 32, maybe you go up to 34. It doesn't take a whole lot to make a big difference. But adjusting the size of the idle feed restriction gives you control over the idle mixture screw. All of this controls the idle feed port and the transition slot. It's all about a low speed idle and low speed cruise. Underneath the power valve is the power valve channel restriction. These two little holes underneath here. From the factory, those come about 56 or 58 thousandths, depends on the metering block. All metering blocks are not the same. There's a great amount of difference from one metering block to the other. But if you're trying to lean out your primary circuit with the main jets, then you got to add a little bit more fuel back into the primary circuit with the power valve channel restriction. So maybe you go up to, from 58, you go up to 60 or 62 thousandths. It depends on the total volume of fuel that you're putting in the main circuit. And that's where you look up how much fuel each different size jet flows in cubic centimeters. And you balance out how much you got on each barrel of your carburetor, how much on the primary side, how much on the secondary side. It's all a mathematical formula, but on the primary circuit, as you make the main jet smaller to get you a nice lean cruise down the highway, you wind up making the power valve channel restriction bigger, so when you stand on it, you're still getting the right amount of fuel through the primary circuit. Hope that explains it, because that's all I got. I've got two metering blocks here set aside. The left one is the original one that came with this Bary Grant carb, and the right one is one from BLP, Bolaw's Performance in Orlando. They're a great source for carburetor parts. So there's a couple of things here. On this original metering block, I actually drilled and tapped the holes for the idle feed restrictions, and then underneath the power valve, I drilled and tapped the power valve channel restrictions, these two little holes here on both sides underneath the power valve, so I can put a jet in there. Those are two important parts of tunability on your carburetor, and it's nice to have a metering block that everything's already drilled and tapped for. On this metering block, you can see the emulsion bleeds. There's 2, 4, 5 of them on this block, and on this metering block there was only 2 emulsion bleeds. You only need 2 emulsion bleeds. I'm running a 26 in the top, a blank, and then a 24, and then 2 more blanks in this BLP block, and that works out just fine for me. The other part of adjustability on your carburetor are these little set screws that you see here. The idle air bleed and the high speed air bleed. And you can see on this carburetor it was drilled and tapped, and I'm able to put set screws in and drill out those set screws to the size I want. On some other carburetors you might have to drill the main body of the carburetor out to make those air bleeds adjustable. But either way, that's the pathway to tuning your carburetor. Alright, so we're talking about Holley 4-barrel carburetors. Yeah, it's pretty easy to make the wide open throttle circuit work, make the secondaries work. You got some jets, you can make that work, and you can make the primary side of it work pretty good with jets too, but then you still got to mess with the power valve. And the power valve is just a control feature that adds more fuel, but there's a little jet behind the power valve, so you need to be able to maybe change that jet. As you're setting up your carburetor on the main side, it's easy to get down the highway and just keep leaning it out and leaning out the main jets until it surges a little bit, and then put back a little fuel, and you're probably pretty good. But once you start getting on it, then you got to deal with things opening in the carburetor with vacuum dropping away and the power valve opening, and once you get to that point, there's little jets behind the power valve, and you might need to change those if you've got the main system running nice and lean. So you buy some of these little set screws. These are little brass set screws. These are 1032s by 3/16. They're the ones that work in the power valve channel. You get them from McMaster Car. Look them up online. They're a great hardware source. And then once you get those little screws. You take one, you put it on the end of the Allen wrench and go over to your drill. You chuck that little set screw right up in your drill, and then you get the right size bit that you want to use and put that in a little pin vise like this one. I'm trying to put it on a white background where you can see it. I think this one's like a 26 thousandths. And then you're holding that little pin vise into the drill, but yeah, it kind of works like. Anyway, that's the way you drill out these little set screws. And there's all sorts of different sizes of them because there's all sorts of different orifices in your carburetor. So I drilled out a bunch of these little set screws, and I've got them stored in these little 7-day medicine boxes that you can get at Walgreens or wherever else. Take a little acetone, clean them Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday off, write your own numbers on them, make yourself a library of little jets at all different sizes, and you'll be ready to go to work. That air fuel gauge for your car is probably a good idea if you're really going to get into tuning a carburetor. Make your life much simpler. But it was more than just jets getting that carburetor to be good. Here's the original tag that came with the carburetor. It tells you what the jetting was: 74, 84, 6.5 power valve, squirters, 31, 35. But what it didn't tell you was what the idle air bleed and the high-speed air bleeds were on a carburetor. And that resulted in a set of plugs that looked like this. This is the way the plugs ran coming out of the car when I first started it without any special setting up. This is the way the carb set up from Bary Grant. This is the plugs it produced, and they look like shit. So I kept the little book, and the reason I like the book is I was able to keep it on the seat next to me driving the car, writing down what the readings are from the air fuel meter. And here you can see at 1,000 RPMs, I could get it to idle at 14.5 on the AFR gauge, but once it started running 13.5 at 1,500, 2,100, it come up a little bit to 14, and then once it started to get into its own, into the end of the transition slot, and the mains running 11.9, 12.3, 11.9, 11.6 at 3,500, and then started leaning out at 4,000. Wide open throttle was 11.8. So messing around with the carb a little bit, going to 71 thousandths from the 74 thousandths, same 80, going to 84 from 86. Now I'm starting to run 1,000 RPM, 14.2. I'm still in the 13s, still way too rich, but it's not as rich as it was. So I'm still going in that same direction, and eventually, when I got down to 70 on the main jets, actually 70 on the driver's side, 69 on the passenger side, 62 thousandths on the power valve channel restriction, and 83 thousandths on the secondary jets, going from 76 on the mains to 70, and going from 74 on the mains initially, going from 74 on the mains and 86 on the secondaries to 70 on the mains and 83 on the secondaries. That got the air fuel readings. I'm in high 14s, low 15s at 2,000, 15.2, 3,000, cruising around, 15.3 on the highway, 15.4. Wide open throttle, it still pops back down to 12.5. So I noted this is pretty good. And that yielded a set of plugs that look like this. So pretty big difference from this to this. These might be a hair on the lean side. Maybe you want to be a little closer over here. The electrode of the spark plug, if you look at it, will show you where your timing is at. If you look right down here towards the bend, and this plug hasn't been used a lot, but you can see a little discoloration down there by the bend, and that discoloration comes from timing. So if you got too much timing, the discoloration will be closer down to the base of the plug, and if you have not quite enough timing, that discoloration will be up towards the electrode end of the tip. So you want to be dealing with your timing, trying to get that mark there in the middle of the electrode on the plug. As far as the plug goes, spark plugs are a lot like the carburetor. The base area right down around the bottom here on the porcelain shows your wide open throttle mixture. Further up on the plug is your mid-range, and then up towards the top, on the top is the indication of how your idle's going. So these plugs look pretty decent. These are out of my regular driving stuff, not a lot of hot rod stuff, just driving down the road. This one here's got some quarter-mile passes on it. You see that wide open throttle stuff starting to color more because we're doing more wide open throttle. Before you start molesting your carburetor, you really need to know what you've got. So most of the measurements you're going to deal with are in the metering block or in the main body of the carburetor. You can buy pin gauges, these little rods that are specifically machined to this one's 64 thousandths, and use them to measure the orifices that you're trying to deal with. I'm looking at one of the emulsion bleeds in this Holley style block here. That 64 thousandths doesn't fit. It's probably closer to 24 thousandths. But what I'm trying to tell you here is that pin vises, or you can actually use just the regular shank of a drill, just the shank of a drill bit, but you have to be able to measure the holes that you've got. Then to make stuff adjustable, you wind up getting a small set of taps like these, and all of this little stuff taps, these little brass set screws. I buy all this from McMaster Car. Look them up on the internet. They're a great hardware store. Everything's reasonable. They ship right out, yada yada. I really like those guys. And then you go back and you look on a cross-reference and you see what size drill bit for whatever you're doing. If you're doing like 1032, it's a number 21 5/32 drill bit. So you go back in with your tap, you use the tapered tap first, then you use the bottoming tap, and you actually tap out these little tiny holes so that you can get a little tiny set screw in there, such as this one. All sorts of different set screws you're going to need, all sorts of different taps, all sorts of different drill bits to make all of this work. But basically, the 6/32 here, 6/32 by 1/8 inch and 6/32 by 3/16, these little guys are the ones that you use for the idle feed restriction, this little hole that I was showing you over here, and also for the emulsion bleeds if you get into a different kind of metering block. This metering block here is an old GM style metering block, and the emulsion bleeds, there's only 2 of them, and that's for the most part all you're ever going to really need is 2 emulsion bleeds. But if you're changing them, or if you buy a set of metering blocks like the BLP blocks that are on the carburetor now, then you're going to need those 6/32 by an 1/8 inch long set screws to play with the emulsion bleeds. There's those 8/32 by 3/16 set screws that work in the BLP metering blocks for the power valve channel restriction. Lots of pieces to the puzzle. You can do this. Take your time. Here you can see a couple of those brass set screws. The one on the right hand side closest to the center of the carburetor is the high-speed air bleed, and the one on the outside is the idle air bleed. And you're going to be messing with those a little bit to adjust your fuel curve. What you find is changing that idle air bleed affects when the transition slot tapers off. So if you're looking at your air fuel readings and you're right around 1800, 2000, 2200, suddenly everything's getting pretty rich. What's happening is you're getting fuel from the main circuit which may be coming in too soon, and you're getting this fuel from the idle circuit, which may not be tapering off yet. So that's really what you're trying to do, is adjust that point of where the main circuit ends, where the main circuit begins and where the transition circuit ends. Back over here, micrometer is pretty important to be able to measure your drill bit sizes, measure your pin gauge sizes. You just want to measure everything. So here you see there's a couple of things laying next to the metering block. There's a power valve and there's some gaskets. Again, I go back to BLP for buying carburetor parts and supplies. Their gaskets, their metering block gaskets, are just better gaskets. The Holley blue gaskets used to be good, but we're seeing those start to flake off now. I don't know if they're made in China or what, but these BLP gaskets are excellent. And you also want a good gasket on the power valve. Those power valve channels we were just looking at down there, if you just lay the gasket in and screw the power valve in, there's a good chance your power valve isn't going to be really seated square on the gasket, and you're going to wind up getting a leak. So the trick is to turn it upside down, the gasket centered on the little ring on the power valve, and you screw the power valve in holding the metering block upside down so that gasket stays centered on the power valve, because there's no ridge or anything on the metering block to center that gasket. The other thing is you want a good gasket for the power valve. BLP's got them, or Quick Fuel also makes good gaskets for power valves. So little stuff like that keeps stuff from leaking. If you take the metering block off your carburetor and you look into the power valve well and it's wet in there, it shouldn't be. It should be dry. So if you're paying any kind of close attention here, I can get that out with one hand. This power valve is a 10.5 power valve. I think you can see it there. There it is, 10.5. So that means the power valve opens when the vacuum drops to 10.5 inches. And that's the thing you have to remember about power valves, is that they open as vacuum goes away. So when you're cruising down the road, you've got 20 inches of vacuum or 18 inches of vacuum, whatever your engine's putting in. As you step on the gas, that vacuum goes away. And as that vacuum goes away, that's when the power valve opens. So a power valve that's got a 10.5 rating opens sooner than a power valve that has a 6.5 rating. And I find that if you get the metering just right on the carburetor, where you're going down the road 15 to 1, 15.5 to 1, nice and lean on the highway, then you want a power valve that opens a little bit sooner, because as you start leaning into the throttle a little bit, you're going to be pretty lean, and you want to get that extra fuel in. You don't want to wait until you've got the vacuum all the way down to 6 or 4 inches where you're really on it before the power valve starts to open. You need to have that main circuit enriched. So that's the key. I wind up, I'm running a 9.5 power valve in my car now. I've got 22 inches of vacuum going down the highway, and it works out just fine. Power valve has nothing to do with the idle circuit. Main jets have nothing to do with the idle circuit. The idle circuit is controlled entirely by the idle enrichment screws here, and they control the fuel, as we talked about before, that goes to the transition slot and that goes to the idle discharge port. Those little screws on the side of the metering block, if you're running rich at idle, those screws need to be adjusted. And if you can't adjust those screws, if you can't make it run lean by cranking them all the way down, or making it run rich by opening them all the way up, that's the time that you want to mess with this idle feed restriction here. That's where you want to put more fuel into the circuit, so there's more fuel available to that idle enrichment screw on the side, or you want to take away fuel so there isn't as much fuel available to the idle enrichment screw. You really want to have that idle enrichment screw at about between a turn and a quarter out. That's where it just seems to work. What else am I missing here? Pin vises and little fixtures. So you're going to drill some of these little brass set screws out. How exactly you do that? Well, I showed you before. You can do that by chucking the set screw up in the drill, spinning the drill, and then holding the bit in a pin vise, or you can make up a little fixture like this that's tapped. This one I think is tapped for 10-30 seconds, but you can screw your set screws in here, chuck this up in a vise, put it under a drill press, and you could drill them that way also. So there's a couple different ways to do stuff. I've got all those little plastic vials and plastic containers. These little guys here, my wife used to get for me. They used to give them away in the department stores at the makeup counter with little samples of makeup in them, but all of that's gone away since the COVID fiasco. But you need a little container as you take stuff out and you try things to put the stuff, the jets or the set screws or whatever, put them in a little container so you can go back to your previous setting if the one that you're changing to doesn't work. Again, write everything down, make notes, measure twice, drill once, basic stuff. Last power valve. Here you can see the secondary side of the main body on my carburetor, and you can see the brass set screws. There's two of them, one on each side, that restrict the flow of fuel to the transition slot. So that's another kind of tuning tool that you have. And you can also see the threads have been replaced in the main body. It looks like a helicoil, but it's not a helicoil. It's a insert called a time cert, and you buy this little kit, and it comes with the drill and the installation tool and two different taps and a bunch of the inserts, and these are far superior to helicoils. They make these for a lot of different applications. Time certs, you should know about that. So that's where we're at right now. So we'll drain the secondary float bowl so we can take it off. I like these little nylon washers under the float bowl screws. I'm using an old Craftsman screwdriver that's had the tip ground down on it so it fits the whole width of the jet. Last piece of the puzzle in this Pontiac hot rod powered by Chevrolet is the air induction system. The cowl box is the low pressure area on any car, the area at the base of the windshield. So this one's got like a lot of vents in it. It's real nice, and the inside of it is lined with Cool Mat, which is a silicone type mat that's really good for protecting against heat. So that box stays nice and cool. And then I've got these two 4-inch hoses that come up to the air box. Another homemade piece. There's what the inside looks like. Pretty good flow into the carburetor. 4-inch filter. And then the air box is also cut back into the firewall. So it's drawing air from back there. I just keep replacing the foam and the seal to make that work. So that's the deal with that. Oh, and this little Pontiac symbol here, I'm really not into stickers and all of that, but this just reminds me it's red. It's a coffee can that I put over the filter for my vacuum pump so that I don't crush it when I'm working on the car, because it's real easy to lean over and put your elbow. I've been up a couple of those already. So that's it. It's kind of like a remove before flight. I see it when I close the hood. That's all I got for now. There'll be more.